Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel and to another true crime video. If you are new to my channel and you're wondering why I'm speaking in a soft-spoken voice, that is because this is an ASMR channel. However, I know that there are many people who enjoy true crime content but perhaps don't enjoy the whispers that come with ASMR, so this is kind of my way of meeting in the middle and hopefully creating content that everyone can enjoy. So this video is actually part 2 of the Michelle Martinko case. So if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I highly recommend doing that, or this video will not make any sense at all. Before we get into it, I'd just like to ask that you please like this video if you do end up liking this video, and comment down below what videos you would like to see in future. Please also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Each and every one of you is so highly valued to me. So, I'll give you a quick rundown of where we left off in part 1 of this case. So, Michelle Martinko was an 18-year-old girl who had been brutally murdered in 1979 in her car in the Westdale Mall parking lot in her hometown of Cedar Rapids. So the case had unfortunately gone cold, but in 2006, 27 years after her murder, a new detective, Detective Doug Larison, had taken on the case and had made some progress due to finding DNA evidence, which was previously unable to be looked at just due to technology not being advanced enough. So he had uploaded this DNA to CODIS to see if there were any criminals whose DNA matched, and on finding that there wasn't, he had taken it upon himself and his team to go and get manual DNA samples from anyone who Michelle may have known or who could have been potentially someone who had it out for Michelle. Now, the person at the top of their list was Michelle's ex-boyfriend Andy Seidel, but he came back as not a match, and the next person on their list was Curtis Thomas, the last person that Michelle was friends with to have seen her that night, and his DNA came back not a match either. So that pretty much catches you up, so let's get into it. At this point, it was 2015, and Detective Larison had been working on the case for almost 10 years when he decided that it was time for another pair of fresh eyes to take a look at it. And this was when he handed Michelle's case over to another detective with a personal connection to the case, Detective Matt Denlinger. And if the name Denlinger sounds familiar, it's because Detective Matt Denlinger was actually the son of Harvey Denlinger, who had been the initial lead detective of Michelle's case and had worked the scene of the crime the night of her murder. Matt Denlinger was just 5 years old when Michelle was murdered, but he had grown up with the case due to his father being the lead detective in the 70s and 80s. He said of the crime, quote, "The whole city was affected, for sure. This young, vulnerable person was involved, and to never get an answer, it feels like the danger isn't out of town." When Detective Denlinger took over the case from Detective Larison, he knew that he was in for a lot of work, going through the hundreds of boxes of files and reports on Michelle's case. He was determined, but said that that wasn't the first step in taking on a big case, saying, quote, "You start by pouring yourself a cup of coffee and wheeling yourself over to Larison's desk so he can tell you about the case and why it's solvable." For the next 8 months, Detective Larison went through every single file and report on Michelle's case, which was reportedly about 7,800 pages. He intended to follow on with Detective Larison's plan to collect DNA samples and compare them to the DNA found at the crime scene. But after going through Michelle's case files with a fine-tooth comb, he recognized that they needed a new strategy, since taking DNA samples from people that Michelle had known just wasn't leading anywhere. Luckily for him, forensic technology had advanced yet again, and after his wife had taken an ancestry DNA kit, he was inspired to contact the company and see if he could upload the suspect's DNA to their system and compare it. Oh, is Mummy home? Is Mummy home? My sister just got home and her dog is very excited, so I will conclude finishing up recording this video another day. Okay, so picking up where we left off, sorry about that brief interruption. So Detective Denlinger decided to ask Ancestry whether or not he could upload the suspect's DNA to their system in order to compare it to anyone who had previously submitted their DNA to Ancestry. However, he was told by the company that this did not fall into the services that they provided and that they didn't allow law enforcement to do this. So Detective Denlinger turned to contacting private labs. In doing so, this led him to Parabon Nanolabs, which is a company in Virginia that helps law enforcement to predict what a suspect may look like based on their DNA. So they do this by a process called Snapshot, which they created, but it was an expensive process, so Detective Denlinger had to create a presentation for his supervisors in order to get the $5,000 needed to do it. He wanted to do this as soon as possible because at this point he believed that time was not on their side. It was now 2016 and he was worried that since it had been so long since the murder had occurred, the killer may be closer to death. He also wanted to find answers for Michelle's family before it was too late. He knew that her parents had already passed, but he wanted to bring closure to the case for everyone who had been affected by Michelle's death, including his own father as well, but most importantly, Michelle's family. Thankfully, Detective Denlinger got the go-ahead from his supervisors to send the suspect's DNA to Parabon Nanolabs, and in 2017, the images generated from the DNA profile were released to the public. And perhaps not surprisingly, this new image or this new set of images looked nothing like the previous sketch that had been revealed back when those two female witnesses had been hypnotized much earlier in the investigation. So this new sketch or new image revealed that Michelle's killer was likely a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the image was released with a few different variations in hairstyles and age to hopefully bring in some solid leads. And although many tips did come in, unfortunately none of them led to Michelle's killer, which was very frustrating and disappointing to Detective Denlinger, who had hoped that this advancement in technology and the progress in the sketch would bring them some answers. And obviously it's a very time-consuming process to go through every lead that you are given through this image, so it was a disappointment that it didn't ultimately lead to the killer being caught. But then something happened that reignited hope in the case. In 2018, one of America's most notoriously uncaught serial killers was finally arrested, all because of DNA evidence. And if you're familiar with true crime, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. It is the Golden State Killer, who had terrorized the citizens of California for over a decade in the 70s and 80s, and he remained unidentified for several decades more. But in 2018, the 74-year-old Joseph DeAngelo was finally caught through DNA evidence, which at last brought closure to the case and to his victims and their families. Detective Denlinger wanted that closure and justice for the Michelle Martinko case, so he approached Parabon Nanolabs again, and they told him that they could use the suspect's DNA to create a family tree of the killer, similarly to how Joseph DeAngelo had been caught. Shout out to Paul Holes, by the way, who was really integral in getting him caught. They would do this by uploading the DNA profile to GEDmatch, which is a public database created for genetic genealogy research. So essentially, GEDmatch is a service where members of the public can voluntarily submit their DNA in order to help with genetic research, which is what a woman named Brandy Jennings had done. Brandy Jennings was a single mother and office manager who lived in Vancouver, and she later said that she had uploaded her DNA to GEDmatch and actually forgotten all about it. But after receiving 4 family trees of great-grandparents of the suspect from Parabon Nanolabs, detectives began the lengthy process of going through marriage records, birth and death records, gravestones and county records to track down any living relatives of the suspect, which is what had led them to Brandy. Brandy was a distant cousin of Michelle's killer, so detectives shifted their focus to filling in Brandy's family tree, which ended up leading them to a first cousin of Michelle's killer, Janice Burns. Detective Denlinger approached Janice Burns about the case, and she was incredibly accommodating and voluntarily provided a DNA sample for them, which was then sent once again to Parabon Nanolabs. From this, Parabon was then able to narrow the search for the killer down to just 3 brothers. They were getting really, really close to catching Michelle's killer, and they were now on the home stretch to solving this case at long last. So the 3 brothers were Donald, Kenneth, and Jerry Burns, and all 3 lived in Iowa and had done at the time of Michelle's murder. The 3 brothers had lived in Manchester, Iowa in 1979, which was about 45 minutes away from Cedar Rapids. Kenneth and Jerry actually both still lived there in 2018, but Donald had moved to Devonport, Iowa. So at first glance, all 3 brothers seemed to be very unlikely suspects. They were all self-made business owners who were well respected in their communities, and none of them had criminal records or any connection whatsoever to Michelle Martinko. At this point, Detective Denlinger knew that the next step was to get DNA samples from all 3 of the brothers, and he started with the brother who he felt was the strongest possibility of being the killer, Kenneth. Law enforcement followed Kenneth Burns to a golf club where they were able to grab a straw from his drink, and they sent this to the lab for DNA testing. But this came back as not a match. So they then moved on to the next brother, Donald Burns, whose DNA they collected from a cup and a toothbrush that he had disposed of in his rubbish. This was then of course sent to be tested, but once again did not come back as a match. So now detectives were down to the last brother, Jerry Burns, whom they had initially thought was the least likely of the 3 to be Michelle Martinko's killer. Jerry was a 64-year-old man who had 2 daughters and a son with his wife Patricia, who had sadly actually died by suicide 10 years earlier at the age of 55. Jerry had started a successful power coating company called Advanced Coating Concepts, and through this he was making a pretty decent living for himself. By 2018 he led a quiet life, leading his company and living with his pet cat, but he was known in the community as a great guy who was always incredibly hardworking and would go out of his way for people, as well as just being a really nice guy who'd always stop and have a chat if you ran into him, and just someone who was well respected in the community. His family had been very active members at St. Mary's Catholic Church, and Jerry obviously had no criminal record, so overall he was seen as this very decent guy by the people in Manchester. But now Jerry Burns was the prime suspect in Michelle's case, and in fact at this point the police knew they essentially had their guy, but they just had to prove it. Detectives collected Jerry Burns' DNA by following him undercover to a pizza restaurant on October 29, 2018, and they waited until Jerry left the premises before swooping in and collecting the straw from the Diet Coke that he had been drinking. The reason they were able to collect DNA in this way for all 3 brothers is because, in the States at least, as soon as someone discards of or disposes of something, anybody can legally take it. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure, and sometimes one man's trash is another man's DNA sample. And this was the case, of course, for detectives with Jerry's straw. And so it was once again sent to the lab for testing, and this time it finally happened. They got a match. And because of this, Detective Denlinger was finally able to come face to face with Michelle's killer. And this point of the case is so satisfying. It is just poetic justice at its finest, so I'll explain a little about what happened. On December 19th, 2018, Detective Denlinger walked into Jerry Burns' business with a coffee cup that held a tiny camera and microphone to capture Jerry's reaction when he was confronted. Detective Denlinger had specifically chosen this exact date, December 19th, because it was the 39th anniversary of Michelle's death. And like I said, if that's not poetic justice, I don't know what is. I mean, you've got the son of the original lead detective on Michelle's case going and confronting her killer at long last on the 39th anniversary of her murder. It sounds like a movie. Like, it sounds too... it just doesn't sound real. But it was. So there's actually footage on YouTube of this exact moment. They played at Jerry's trial the whole confrontation and what happened, and I highly recommend going and watching it because it's just fascinating and so satisfying knowing justice was finally being delivered, but also seeing him kind of squirm and just seeing his reaction. Really fascinating. And it also just kind of puts into context the kind of guy that Jerry Burns seemed to be at face value. He's an older man. He looks like the kind of grandfather who'd like give you $5 or pull some lollies out of his pocket for you when he visited. And not to mention his cat is actually in the video. In fact, his cat's butt is in the video. He sits right in front of the camera for a decent part of it actually, but it just kind of makes him seem even more unassuming. You wouldn't think that you were looking in the face of a killer, but knowing what we know about Jerry and just the fact that his DNA was at the scene of a brutal murder, it's very, very interesting to watch his reaction and watch him squirm and just blink a million times, because I swear this guy, he just blinks and blinks and blinks. And apparently he had glaucoma, but I don't know if that's actually an excuse for how much he blinks. But anyway, since the footage isn't in ASMR, I'll insert some pictures but also describe it for you now. So, retired detective J.D. Smith, who had been helping Detective Denlinger with the case, actually went with Detective Denlinger to Jerry's place of business because they weren't sure how he was going to react to this confrontation. They weren't really sure what they were in for. There were also 16 other officers who came to Manchester that day, and they had audio transmitters so that they could constantly be listening to the confrontation, to the interview, and jump in to help if needed. So, at approximately 11:45 a.m., they entered Jerry's business, Detective Denlinger and J.D. Smith, that is, and they weren't wearing uniform and approached him in a pretty friendly, casual manner, but they did pretty much immediately inform him that they were with the Cedar Rapids Cold Case Unit, and they asked if they could talk to him about a case that they were working on. And Jerry was very nonchalant. He agreed, so the detectives sat down and they informed him that they were working on the Michelle Martinko homicide case and asked if he had heard of it. And Jerry said that, oh yeah, I think I heard of it, a long time ago. And the detectives explained that they had an article in the paper recently that showed the new image of the potential suspect. And from this, sorry, my shoulder just cracked. And from this, they had received a lot of new leads. And Jerry's name, in fact, had come up because of this. And Jerry immediately remarked that, well, that was strange, that's odd that my name would come up. And Detective Denlinger explained that, it's not all that uncommon. We got a heap of leads. We're just having to go through, follow up on all of them. So, it's not that big of a deal. They were really kind of playing it down, being very casual. So at this point, Detective Denlinger handed Jerry a copy of the snapshot images that Parabon Nanolabs had created, and after flipping through them briefly, Jerry just said, quote, "Wow, well, looks a lot different than I look in the mirror," and kind of laughed, to which Detective Denlinger just laughed along and went along with it before leading into some questions he had for Jerry. The first being what he had heard of the case and what he remembered of it. Jerry, of course, denied knowing much. He just said that he remembered it was a big deal, but that he didn't really remember who the victim was and hadn't known her or anything. But then randomly, unprompted, Jerry says that he had recently seen something in the news about Jody Huisentruit. So this was incredibly odd and a big red flag, because Jody Huisentruit was actually a young blonde news anchor who lived in Mason City, Iowa, and had disappeared on the early morning hours of June 27th, 1995, and the case has never been solved. So for Jerry to have brought this up unprompted when being questioned about a completely different murder case, but one that has a lot of similarities to the Jody Huisentruit case, that's extremely suspicious and just leads to more questions. So after this, Jerry said, quote, "Well, that's strange, those pictures. Do I look like that?" And Detective Denlinger remained very casual and just said, "Oh, well, you look enough like it for us to come and check you out, but we just have to err on the side of caution. It's no big deal." And he then asked Jerry some basic questions about himself, like his full name, birthday, where he had lived during his life, whether he'd gone to college, and then Detective Denlinger transitioned into some more specific questions, such as what he had been doing in 1979. And that's when we find out that in 1979 Jerry was about 25 years old and he had been a John Deere salesman. We also find out that he had a brown 1974 Chevy Malibu and had gone to the Westdale Mall in the past, but not frequented Cedar Rapids a lot. He really tried to play it down and said, I've only been there with my family. And Jerry is very, very casual, almost too casual during these questions. But if you look closely, you can tell he's trying to keep his hands busy by petting the cat at points, and he's trying to act casual, but also he's sort of fiddling, distracting himself, and he's definitely starting to blink more often, more rapidly. Then Jerry asks about the snapshot pictures once again, questioning whether those are the only pictures they have of the suspect, and the detectives explain that yes, they are, and they tell him what the process was for creating the images with, the DNA and whatnot. And Jerry takes another look at the pictures. You can see he's trying to be casual and just seeming, generally interested in them, but you can tell he's really scrutinizing them and stressing, worried over whether they actually look like him. So he just keeps going back to the pictures. And the questioning goes on about whether Jerry was married at the time of Michelle's murder and if he had siblings and why he had gone to Westdale Mall in the past. And then Detective Denlinger explains how the investigation had been progressing over the years and that they had been collecting and testing DNA, and they then presented Jerry with a search warrant, which Jerry quickly looked over and he made the comment, quote, "Never seen one of these before." And you can kind of tell that he might be starting to freak out a little bit more now. His eye area, and his eyebrows kind of start to twitch a little. And after briefly reading the document, he sort of aggressively pats the cat again and, fiddles with his hand, and he starts blinking heaps, but he shows no resistance when the detectives swab his mouth, and he just kind of nods along when they're explaining that they have to do this with everyone who is a potential lead, and that it takes a few days to process, but they'll let him know what comes from it. And so Jerry's super casual and cooperative. He's definitely trying to stay calm. And then, and this is my favorite moment, then Detective Denlinger throws a curveball at him and says, quote, "We kind of know going in that this is probably going to be a match." And all Jerry Burns says is, quote, "Oh really? Why would that be?" He doesn't freak out. He doesn't seem shocked or surprised or angry like, you'd expect a normal person probably would after being told something like that. I mean, he's essentially being told, hey, we've got you. We know that your DNA is going to be a match. We know that you're the murderer. And Detective Denlinger goes on to say, quote, "Well, we're kind of hoping you'd tell us. The reality is, we're not here on a whim. We're here to confirm what we already know. I already collected some DNA from you that you got rid of before. And so I'm telling you, Jerry, I already know that your DNA is going to match the DNA that we have on file." And to this, which is a huge bombshell, Jerry just shrugs and shakes his head and blinks frantically, of course, but he gets really hung up on the DNA that they had previously collected, that he had thrown away, as the detectives had told him. He doesn't really seem to understand that basically everything has your DNA on it, so all it took was a straw that he used to get his DNA, but he just doesn't seem to be able to grasp that concept. I mean, like I said, in the 1970s, when he committed this murder, DNA was something almost of science fiction, so I imagine that his age probably contributes to him not being able to understand exactly what the detectives are telling him. So Detective Denlinger said, quote, "We have your DNA at the crime scene, and so we know that you were there that night this happened. But what we don't know, Jerry, is why it happened." And he goes on to try to get Jerry to explain what happened, using the tactic of kind of seemingly allowing Jerry to give a justified explanation of what happened that night, and almost give him like an out so that he could say something along the lines of, yeah, okay, I killed her, but it was in self-defense, or something, along those lines, just essentially trying to get him to confess to being there, or confess to having killed Michelle, but so that even if he is giving excuses, they've got that confession and it would still implicate him in the crime. But Jerry is not budging. He's still maintaining this very calm demeanor, even though he's just been essentially accused of murder. And he just keeps telling them, test the DNA, test it. He's shaking his head, he's shrugging, he's saying, just test it. We'll see. Even though they keep explaining that no, we already have. We've tested the DNA that we collected from you, and it was a match to the DNA at the crime scene. The jig is up, Jerry. And Detective Denlinger is still very calm and collected himself. He's still talking to Jerry in a pleasant manner, and he keeps asking, is there any way, Jerry, that your DNA could have been at the crime scene? Did you go shopping that day and bump into Michelle? Did you accidentally get into the wrong car? Did you drop someone off at the mall? He's just giving ideas along those lines, even though he knows this isn't the case. I mean, they've got blood evidence. Detective Denlinger isn't stupid. He's actually using an intelligent technique that's just trying to get him to admit that he was at Westdale Mall on the night of December 19th, 1979, even if he doesn't confess to murdering Michelle. But Jerry just keeps shaking his head no, remaining very neutral, but just not budging. Just deny, 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 and blink, blink, blink. It's so distracting how much he blinks. And he's also doing that thing where he's saying no, but he's nodding his head yes, and he seems to be having some kind of acid reflux problems or something like that. He's sort of swallowing and almost burping, but just his mannerisms suggest something along those lines. And I am no body language analyst by any stretch of the imagination, and I know that it's not foolproof anyway, but just from consuming a lot of that kind of content, I thought it was definitely worth noting. But you can see the footage for yourself, like I said, and let me know what you think. Now, Detective Denlinger isn't letting Jerry off the hook despite his constant denials. He's telling him that they know he was there that night. They know that he knows what happened. They're just asking him why. Why did it happen? Why is your DNA at the crime scene? But Jerry just keeps denying it and even says, quote, "You believe what you believe." Wow. And Detective Denlinger sort of switches tactics at one point, and he starts asking Jerry, is there a reason someone would have written your number plate down? And Jerry gets a little more defensive and says, quote, "What was the plate number? What plate number do you have? I don't believe it. If there was a plate number, why would it take that many years?" And Detective Denlinger just says he doesn't have the plate number in his paperwork at present, because in reality he was bluffing. He was just trying to get Jerry to confess something. They actually didn't have the plate number. But I find Jerry's response very interesting, that he says, if there was a plate number, why would it take that many years? In a subtle way, he is implicating himself just through his weird responses and actions. But anyway, instead of showing him the plate number, Detective Denlinger pulls out a photo of Michelle, and he tells Jerry to take a look at it. He says, take a good long look at that photo. But Jerry still denies ever talking to her or knowing her at all. He looks right at Michelle's face, but he just shakes his head and blinks and kind of shrugs. And then he gets a call from his brother, which he takes, and he gets up and walks out of frame for a minute, but the call is very short and doesn't really amount to much, and the interview footage ends shortly after. So that's a rundown of the footage and what happened when Jerry was confronted, and directly afterwards he was read his rights and was arrested. He was then put into the back of a police car in handcuffs, and he sat next to Detective Denlinger on the car ride from Manchester to Cedar Rapids. And the car ride was actually filmed as well, and you can find that on YouTube too. It was shown at Jerry's trial once again. But since it's like an hour or so car ride, it's pretty long, and they're not talking the whole time. But Jerry does start to say to Detective Denlinger that he knows it's possible to block things out in your memory if they're too difficult to deal with. So he's almost, in a way, starting to confess very subtly, maybe I did this, but I just blocked it out. I know that happens sometimes. So that was something interesting that happened in the car. But Jerry was still very calm, very neutral. He wasn't freaking out about the fact that he was being arrested for murder. He wasn't resisting or protesting or anything. He wasn't defending himself. He just kind of seemed resigned to the fact that it was happening. So it's clear that it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a surprise to him the way it would be to an innocent person. Now, Jerry Burns was charged with the first-degree murder of Michelle Martinko, and on December 20th, 2018, his bond was set at $5 million. When word of Jerry Burns' arrest got out to everyone who knew him, they were just shocked. Jerry Burns had been a well-known, well-respected member of the community, but Jerry was never able to give an alternate explanation as to why his DNA may have been present at the crime scene,
nor did he give a reason why he had killed Michelle, nor even admit ever to killing Michelle. His family hired attorney Leon Spies to defend Jerry during his trial, but it seems as though the murder charge came as a shock to them as well, particularly Jerry's children, and they put out a public statement saying, quote, "The charge against Jerry comes as a complete shock to us, and we are doing our best to carry on with our lives during this difficult time, and as the justice system runs its course, we ask that our privacy be respected." So, before we get into the trial, let's talk a little about Jerry Burns. So there wasn't a lot of information out there about him, but what we do know is that he was born on the 23rd of December 1953, making him just 4 days off 26 years old at the time of Michelle's murder. At this point, when he was 26 essentially, he had been married for 4.5 years to his wife Patricia, and in 1979 they had 2 children together, one of whom was just a baby. So I'll be putting some pictures up of Jerry and his family to better show what he looked like around the time of Michelle's murder, and just to kind of show the kind of family man reputation he sort of had at face value, because it's very interesting but very eerie knowing what we know about him. Other than that, Jerry was a John Deere salesman at the time of Michelle's murder and overall seemed like a pretty average guy, nothing out of the ordinary. Jerry's trial was originally scheduled for October 14th, 2019, but there were several delays due to the defense asking for the trial to be moved out of Linn County, since there had been so much media attention on the case there. So it was rescheduled to start on February 10th, 2020, and after 2 days of jury selection, his actual trial started on February 12th, 2020, so not long ago at all. During the trial, Jerry's lawyer, Leon Spies, who had defended many high-profile clients before, tried to get the DNA evidence in the case thrown out by arguing that the detectives didn't have a warrant when they got Parabon Nanolabs to upload the DNA profile from Michelle's dress, and that the DNA collected from Jerry's straw was a warrantless search and seizure. But thankfully, this motion was denied because it was abandoned property, like I explained earlier, so law enforcement were acting within the law. Leon Spies also tried to suppress the evidence the detectives had discovered on Jerry's computer, and this time he was successful. So the jury never got to know about the incredibly disturbing things that the police had found. Police had gone through over 300 pages of Jerry's search history and over 400 pages of his website history, in which they discovered that Jerry had very recently made many disturbing searches about things such as having sex with a freshly deceased body and strangling and stabbing blonde women, amongst many other things. I think we can only imagine what else he was looking up. It's not hard to assume what kind of content he was looking for. But, like I said, Leon Spies had gotten this evidence suppressed because he argued that his internet history was irrelevant since it had been made in 2018, so many years after the murder of Michelle. But, in my opinion, it just makes Jerry Burns even more disgusting and terrifying. The fact that he clearly still had an interest in these very morbid, disgusting, criminal things in 2018. It just makes me wonder if Michelle was the only person that he killed, especially since he spent 39 years not being caught. And also, he brought up Jodi Huisentrude's disappearance, so it's all just very suspicious. But anyway, during the trial, many people testified on behalf of the prosecution, such as friends of Michelle's and anyone who had seen her at the choir banquet or the mall that night. So all the people that I had spoken of earlier, from Phoebe, the mall employee, to Cheryl, who had seen her, to the boys who had run into her at the mall, and of course Curtis Thomas. And I thought it was worth bringing up Curtis's testimony specifically because he explained his relationship with Michelle and also what had happened that night. He had seen her in quite a lot of detail, and when asked why he remembered this so well, he said, quote, "There's things in your life that happen that you just don't forget," end quote. And quote, "I remember that night. I remember Michelle, her smile, the goodbye smile. I mean, it's affected my entire life." He actually teared up when talking about Michelle's smile, which was incredibly heart-wrenching and so hard to watch. His pain is just so visible, and it just makes these true crime cases so real. I mean, we have to remember this is not just a story. This is a real person who had real connections with others, and it affected so many people. Curtis also recalled that he found out about Michelle's death the day following her murder when he was called out of school by 2 police officers who took him to the station to question him. And they didn't immediately tell him what it was about. They just started questioning and interrogating him. And he said, quote, "I realized it was about Michelle, and it just sucks the breath out of your lungs." Truly, if you guys are interested and have time, I highly recommend watching the trial. It is absolutely fascinating. I watched a lot of it, a lot of the testimonies and whatnot. It just really gave you insight into Michelle and her life and the effect that she had on everyone, and how tragic it was that such a light in the world was snuffed out so young. And of course, it's also very interesting to see Jerry Burns sitting there, and I'll definitely put images of all of this up so that you can see, but he was just so revolting during the whole trial. But okay, let's get back to the trial itself. Several other people who had seen Michelle that night testified, like I said. So there was Cheryl Anders, Phoebe Porter, and the boy she had run into the mall. And some of the people who had been friends with Michelle also testified, one of whom being Jane Hansen, who was Michelle's best friend, who she'd gone to the choir banquet that night with, but who had ultimately turned down Michelle's offer to go to the mall with her. And Jane Hansen only had good things to say about Michelle. She shared anecdotes about her, and it was clear that she still remembered her fondly, but there was a lot of pain, and you could see she was shaken by testifying. Jane also recalled that the morning after Michelle's murder, after she had received that panic phone call from Michelle's parents the night before, she rang their house in the morning, but no one answered, so she just assumed that everything was back to normal, and she got ready for school as usual. But Michelle, of course, didn't show up to school, which concerned Jane, so she started asking around about where she might be, and that was when one of her baton-twirling teammates actually informed her of what had happened. And Jane said that she went right home after that, and during this part of her testimony, you can obviously see that she is visibly upset. And I just wanted to talk about that because it really is moving, but it just puts these cases into perspective as well. Andy Seidel, Michelle's ex-boyfriend, also testified, and it was really sweet, but also just so sad to hear him speak of Michelle, who he also clearly remembered very, very fondly. One thing that he said in particular that stood out to me was, quote, "It's hard to characterize someone as good and as pure as she was in terms of how she treated others." He also explained how they met and what their relationship had been like, and he recalled that when they started dating, he recalled the roller skating rink and said, quote, "When we both realized we had a passion for pizza is when the dating started," which is how I found out about their whole story, and it was very sweet to hear him recall all of that. And he also told his story of the night of Michelle's murder, and that he had found out about Michelle's death the following day by the police, much like Curtis Thomas had. Jerry Burns' cellmate in the Lynn County Jail, Michael Ellison, also testified on behalf of the prosecution, and he said that during their time as cellmates, he and Jerry had grown very close to the point that Jerry would often refer to Michael as his son, even though Michael was 53 years old, so he's not a lot younger than Jerry. But they would often play cards together and talk about their lives, and Michael said that he had asked Jerry if he had committed the crime, and in response, all Jerry could say was, quote, "I can't talk about this." But he never confirmed or denied it. Michael Ellison also spoke of a day in the jail when Jerry's picture was in the Cedar Rapids newspaper due to an article about Michelle Martinko being published. Jerry actually signed a copy of the newspaper for Michael, writing, quote, "To my favorite son, Michael." And you have to remember, Jerry has a son, so I can't imagine how he, his real biological son, felt on seeing that, given that he was still standing by his father. He still believed he was innocent and that this was, a miscarriage of justice. Michael Ellison also told a very eerie story of how one day when they were playing pinochle, Michael kept beating Jerry, and in response, Jerry said that if Michael kept beating him at the game, he would have to take him to the mall, which is so disturbing. And it was actually this comment that prompted Michael to contact the authorities and voluntarily agree to be the state's witness, because he was just so disgusted by this comment. And one interesting thing that Michael said to the jury about Jerry Burns was, quote, "He feels like that no matter what happens in this case, that he wins, because he had the opportunity to be out there with his family all these years." Which is unfortunately just the tragic, sad reality of it. Unlike the prosecution, who had called many witnesses to testify, the defense called only one, a man named Dr. Michael Spence, who was a self-described DNA consultant. But the only argument that he had was that Jerry's DNA may have been present at the crime scene due to DNA transfer, and he claimed that this could have occurred because the original detectives on the case had bagged the physical evidence together. And he was referring to all of Michelle's clothing from that night being put in one bag. But this was a reach on the defense's part. They gave it a shot, but the argument was weak, especially since it was Jerry's blood DNA that had been found at the crime scene. So the prosecution clearly had a much stronger case than the defense did, the only hole being that they couldn't prove a motive, since Michelle hadn't been robbed or sexually assaulted and Jerry hadn't known her. However, they did argue that just because Michelle hadn't been sexually assaulted that night doesn't mean it wasn't Jerry's intention, but perhaps Michelle had put up far more of a fight than he had expected, and she'd fought back so fiercely that Jerry killed her before he had the chance to assault her, particularly because he had clearly cut himself during the attack. And this is generally the theory that most people go with, and myself included. I believe this is most likely what happened, that he was just panicked and he was rushed, and Michelle fiercely fought him off, which not only protected her from sexual assault, but would end up solving her murder in the end. So, by the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for just 3 hours before finding Jerry Lynn Burns guilty of the first-degree murder of Michelle Martinko on February 24th, 2020. Jerry was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he's currently imprisoned in Anamosa State Penitentiary. Michelle's sister Janelle described how it felt in this moment, saying, quote, "We almost couldn't breathe. It was just amazing. It was fabulous." Jerry's family, on the other hand, weren't so relieved, his brother Don saying, quote, "I'd say I was stunned. The verdict came back so fast. I don't know if the jury took the time to look at the facts, end quote. He actually still believed that Jerry could never have done such a thing.
Jerry's daughter also stood by her father, and to this day, Jerry's family seem to believe in his innocence. She actually said, quote, "They wanted an explanation of how his DNA got there. Well, how was he supposed to know from 40 years ago? I can't even remember what I did last week every day." And, quote, "I don't think that there's any way that my dad could have done this." His brother also said, quote, "There's absolutely no way it could have happened." And he actually claimed that Jerry worked at a Buick dealership at the time of Michelle's murder, so that must have been how his DNA got in her car. But Detective Denlinger shoots this down very quickly and easily by saying, quote, "My question for them would be, did the dress go to the Buick dealership too?" So it's clear that it's just a lot of denial that gets Jerry's family in that mental state. I mean, I can't imagine finding out that your father or your brother, who you'd known for so many years, was actually the perpetrator of a brutal, disgusting murder. But still, I don't know how you can look at blood DNA evidence and say there's no way. But there's something they'll never understand, so they are victims too in a way. In 2021, Jerry and his new legal team appealed the conviction, arguing that his DNA had been collected through warrantless extraction and that he had had ineffective counsel from his previous lawyers. But these appeals will likely never go through. He's just grasping at straws at this point. So, at long last, Michelle and her family and friends and community were finally given some closure and justice. Janelle was of course extremely relieved and said, quote, "She fought so hard that she caused the murderer to cut himself. He left his DNA, and so Michelle helped solve her own murder." Detective Denlinger was also thrilled, saying, quote, "He felt extreme relief. The weight of the world was off my shoulders now." However, Detective Denlinger still has his suspicions that Michelle Martinko may not have been the only murder victim of Jerry Burns. When asked by a CBS News correspondent, Jamie Yuccas, who by the way is the interviewer who I got most of these quotes from through the 48 Hours episode, highly recommend watching it. When asked whether he believed that Jerry was involved in other crimes, Detective Denlinger said, quote, "I don't know the answer to that. My gut tells me there's probably something else out there." Jerry Burns did bring up the murder of Jody Huisentruit after all, and there were a couple of other unusual circumstances during his life, such as his wife's suicide and the disappearance of Jerry's cousin, Brian Burns, who to this day is a missing person. Obviously, that's just speculation. He may have had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance or the death of his wife, and I'm not alleging that he did, but I do think it's worth noting. But with that, I think that brings us to the end of this case, and therefore this video. I really did a deep dive on this case. I came out with 18 full pages of research, which is pretty insane, but I really hope that you guys have enjoyed listening to the story. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. I love to see cases being solved by DNA evidence all these years later. It just gives me hope as someone who likes to consume true crime. I also hope that you just enjoyed learning about Michelle Martinko, and what an amazing bright light in the world that she was before she was cruelly snuffed out. Her life may have not had a happy ending, but her kindness does live on, and the people that she affected and touched in her lifetime, and at least now there's some closure and at long last some justice. If you like true crime videos as well, please let me know below what cases you'd like to see in future. I do have a couple in mind, but I'd love to hear you guys' recommendations as well. So other than that, guys, I just ask that you please like this video if you did enjoy it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And until next time, see you later.